The Ugly Duck Compliance. Our ugly duck came across a fine group of birds floating in a pond, and they were quacking and honking. In this flock were ducks, geese, and swans. These different types of birds were all living together, and for the most part, they pretty much understood each other's honking and quacks. As time went by, our duck felt quite at home with this fine flock. But the great duck spirit placed dreams and visions in our duck, and as he and the others got to know each other better, our duck told his brothers and sisters his God-given heart's desires. Thus the trouble began. You see, the leaders of the flock heard of our duck's goals, and each time they got wind of more, they began to realize that they were going to have a talk with our duck. The flock's leaders enjoyed our duck's company, but they were afraid that his mindset could ultimately split up the flock. And as everyone knows, ducks, geese, and swans find security in large numbers. Well, the day finally came when the flock's leaders came to our duck. There was no malice or contention. The leaders truly loved our duck, and our duck loved his new leaders. The leaders were three magnificent birds whose beauty, strength, and grace caused most to stare in awe. There was a duck, a swan, and a goose. Then after our duck and the leaders honked and quacked a while, the swan began to speak. "Brother, your company has enriched all our lives," as he lifted and positioned his right wingtip, directing everyone's view to the whole flock. Then the leader duck began to speak. "Please, brother, tell us of those desires of yours, those desires we've been hearing of." So our duck began to speak, not comprehending that the leaders were not asking these things out of friendship. So with an innocent joy, our duck began to speak. "Good friends, since I've only been with you this one season, I can only tell you that I have heard things and experienced things that fill my heart with joy." The leaders honked and quacked a little. Our duck continued. "Also, I have these ideas." The swan broke in. "Please, brother, tell us of these ideas." Then our duck began. "Before I found this fine group of birds, I've met many other birds. These birds told me that we live in central Michigan. They told me that if I fly west and cross over the huge pond, I will find other birds like me, and you. I want to meet those other birds. I want to tell them of the grace and mercy that the great duck God has shown me. But most of all, I want to fellowship with them." By now our duck noticed that the leaders were troubled, but he continued anyhow. "As we know, our forefathers quacked and honked in a different language than ours. I have been studying the Great Duck Book in its original language. I have found that the original writings of our scriptures are so much deeper and, well, just more." Now the leaders were clearly upset, and as they shook their heads, they gave out a single grunt. Then the goose said, "Please, brother, continue." Now our duck hesitated, wondering what he did wrong, and with a shaky voice filled with confusion he continued. "I want to fly as high or higher than the eagles, to see who or what is out there. Maybe the great duck spirit will meet me up there." Now this clearly upset the three leaders, but now with anger. It was more like they realized that they had a nasty task to perform, and all three of them were in agreement. The goose asked, "Is there more, brother?" Our duck replied, "No, sir." The swan started in on our duck first. "Dear friend, you can't fly as high or higher than the eagles. You will most likely pass out, falling to the earth to your death. You must not speak of this to the flock, especially the young." Just as our duck began to quack, the leader duck began to speak first. "Brother, the other flocks can't be trusted. Please understand." As the leader duck spoke, it seemed that he was almost in tears at what he was about to say. The duck spoke, "Dear friend, us three leaders must meet the other flocks before a member of our flock or our whole flock fellowships with other flocks. We know that you have a pure heart and honorable motives, but the whole flock must stay together. If you go to the other flocks on your own and not as our ambassador, you cannot come back to us. Brother, you must not speak of these things to the flock, especially the young. This dream of yours, which you have told to others, can literally end with the flock being scattered." This time our duck spoke before the goose could begin his assault. "But by the fall, Flocks like ours are always scattered. And he thought, this is no longer my flock. Now, for the first time, the goose looked angry, and it was his turn. It was obvious that these three had dealt with real ducks before, for they knew exactly how, when, and with what emotions to speak with. It was as if this had all been rehearsed. The goose began to speak. We took you into our midst, and you now tell us that you don't trust our interpretation of the ancient scriptures? All these birds that receive our theology is proof that the great duck spirit has called us to lead all the birds. We can't tell you to leave the ancient texts alone. But if you can't keep your theological views to yourself, we have no choice but to ask you to leave. The goose softened a little and asked, now tell us, brother, we want you to stay, but before you do, or say anything theological to any member of the flock, we need to know that you will come to us first. The great duck spirit will reveal to us the things you claim he reveals to you. Will you submit to our authority? Our duck spoke. I will do as you three ask of me, as long as it does not conflict with the will of the great duck spirit. Please, brothers, tell me when I went against your will, didn't do something you asked of me, tried to take your flock from you, or violated the ordinances of the duck scriptures. This irritated the swan, duck, and goose, and in perfect timing all three quacked and honked. Those things are not even the issue. Then for a second, all three understood that they were the gods of the flock, and they really weren't taking care of the great duck god's birds. Then, within another second, they equally understood that they could never part with their power and authority, which they prematurely took before they were meant to. Their pride would never allow them to confess to the flock that they have found others better qualified to lead them. Thus they became the blind that leads the blind into the ditch. Now all three birds, the swan, the leader duck, and the goose, looked at each other. Then the goose and the swan looked at the leader duck and nodded. After all, the leader duck was of the same flesh as this false leader, this troublesome duck. The leader duck swam a little ahead of the other two, and began to speak. Now listen, duck. While it's true that our unique flock scatters every fall, we had that problem solved. That is, until you came along. The seeds you've planted in the young and old alike will be responsible for the flock scattering this time. That is, if we can't repair the damage. With that, the goose said to the swan and leader duck, I don't believe we can keep the flock together with this duck in our midst. I believe he must leave for the good of us all. With that, the leader duck, the swan, and the goose turned their back on our good duck. Then, with sorrow, our good duck turned his back to the three leaders and the flock, and then with great sorrow he flew off alone. Little did our good duck know that most of the flock was extremely angry with the leaders, even though they didn't know exactly what had happened. But in reality, had the flock known what had transpired, it probably wouldn't have made much difference, for the flock was fully submitted to their leaders. What else can we do? It is vital that we understand that whenever we submit ourselves to an individual, group, workplace, a spouse, or the likes, we must submit to their authority, and we will give up some or all of our heart's desires in order to obey the will of our partners. It's okay if we set aside earthly wants, but we will answer to the Lord God if we set aside His will in order to please others. Thus, our duck found out what it means to be unequally yoked to leaders, a person, a spouse, a group, and the likes.